Hi, epistemologists. Today we're discussing Timothy Williamson's knowledge first epistemology. And basically he's going to argue that his attempts to analyze knowledge in terms of belief plus some additional components are mistaken. And so he's going to reformulate the entire project of epistemology in a way that he thinks is better, which is to start with knowledge as a basic notion. And how does he do that? So we're going to be talking about basically the introduction of his book. He wrote a whole book on this topic. And we're focusing on his concept of knowledge first epistemology. So we're going to start by discussing what he sees as problems for the orthodox view. The orthodoxy is seeing the relationship between knowledge and belief as one in which belief is conceptually prior to knowledge. So belief is more basic than knowledge. But on Tim Williamson's view, knowledge is actually conceptually prior to belief. And rather than explain knowledge in terms of things like belief, truth, and justification, we're actually going to explain belief and justification in terms of knowledge. So knowledge is going to be conceptually prior to Williamson. And how do we get there? Well, there's a couple of arguments that we examine for the orthodoxy, and Williamson's going to find problems with each of these arguments. So the first argument is that knowledge entails belief, but not vice versa. So knowledge is something that we build out of belief. You explain this entailment, that knowledge entails belief, by saying that you start with belief and you add things to it to get knowledge. So for example, you start with belief and you add truth and justification, and those are the things that fill in the gap. And those things then are conceptually prior to knowledge. You understand those first, and that's why you define knowledge in terms of them. Williamson rejects this argument for two reasons. One of them is that on his view, knowledge entailing belief and seeing belief as conceptually prior, but you add some stuff to it, that's circular reasoning. Why? Well, because on his view, knowledge is both the thing that we're defining and it's in the definition. And you might ask, how is know in the definition of knowledge? It doesn't feel like knowledge is justified true belief has knowledge in that second half. Well, on Williamson's view, we're already assuming that knowledge is analyzable into component parts in doing this exercise. It's sort of presupposition that whatever it is that we're putting on the right-hand side is going to be sufficient, that there's going to be kind of a set of more basic shapes out of which we build this knowledge shape. But he just doesn't think it's going to work. He thinks it's like trying to build a circle out of triangles. You can find a lot of triangles, but you're never going to get them so that they fit perfectly well to make up this circle. Circles are just sort of basic, and that's how he sees knowledge. So if you think that you're going to be able to find the right triangles to build the circle, you're just mistaken from the outset. You're sort of working against yourself. So the other reason that he thinks that this argument for the orthodoxy is wrong is that without this condition that knowledge is justified true belief, belief can still be a necessary insufficient condition of knowledge. So just if we say that knowledge is conceptually prior, it doesn't mean that we can't see belief as a necessary condition of knowledge, like something we need to have in order to have knowledge, and that's also insufficient by itself, right? So just because we have belief doesn't mean we have knowledge. He thinks that can still be true, even if we think that knowledge is conceptually prior to belief, the knowledge first view. So here's another argument for the orthodoxy. Another argument says that we have approximate definitions of knowledge that could be refined to achieve an optimal analysis. So basically, hey, look, we've done so well. We have these different competing definitions of justification and we're refining them. And if we could only refine them in the right way, we'll get the best possible analysis of knowledge, and that's a project worth pursuing. So basically, there's this optimism that we can still see belief as conceptually prior to knowledge because our approximate definitions have been getting better and better. Williamson's reply is to say that, and quote, the possibility of approximating knowledge in terms of belief and other concepts is not good evidence for the conceptual priority of belief over knowledge, unquote. So he's basically saying that just because we think that we've approximated a definition of knowledge doesn't mean that that's a good reason to think that belief is definitely conceptually prior. Like, there are other things that we might be good at approximating for which we wouldn't be able to show that there's conceptual priority. Basically, the idea is like, just because you've been trying doesn't mean you're going to succeed. You know, trying is not evidence of success, is, I suppose, a way that you could put it. And also, he doesn't mention this directly, but just look at the Gettier problem. You know, the Gettier problem produced tons and tons of writing on this issue. And just because people feel optimistic about solving the Gettier problem doesn't mean it's solvable. So you can kind of take him to implicitly be saying, just because you've gotten closer and closer approximations doesn't mean that you'll get an actual analysis of knowledge in terms of any component parts. We could be trying to build a circle out of triangles. Or put another way, maybe these could be like epicycles, like the epicycles that ended up being postulated by astronomers who continue to believe that the motion of planets around the solar system was circular, but really it's elliptical. And in order to try to make it not elliptical, they had to build in circles inside the circles to explain the observed motion of the stars in the sky, and it just wasn't working. So in a sense, you could take him to say, well, just because you're getting better epicycles doesn't mean that that your analysis is going to be the right one. So here's the third and final argument in favor of the orthodoxy, and we're going to hear Williamson's reply to it. The final argument is what Williamson thinks is an internalist argument, which says that, you know, from inside of our bodies, right, the mental states of belief and knowledge feel the same. Maybe they are the same. So I can't tell the difference between when I believe something or I'm convinced of something and when I actually know it. I have been wrong in the past, even when I was pretty confident in myself. So the internalist view here is that knowledge has an external component that makes it knowledge. So it's like belief plus something outside of me. Belief is the thing inside of me that I have access to, that I know the feeling of, and the thing that makes the belief be knowledge is this external component, like truth, right? So we call this factivity. Knowledge stands or falls with fact. So the thing that I have in common, whether it stands or falls, is the belief. So I have the belief, and then whether or not the belief is true basically determines whether or not I'll have knowledge. So knowledge stands or falls with fact. So the consistent component internally is the belief. And so the orthodoxy says that belief and knowledge feel the same. And so knowledge is kind of an additional achievement of my belief or something like that, right? Williamson counters by saying that this view in philosophy of language called content externalism, on which the meaning of my thoughts and of my language is fixed by the external environment, content externalism suggests that belief also has an external component. Quote, belief as attributed in ordinary language is a genuine mental state constitutively dependent on the external world. So according to content externalism, the content of my belief depends on what's in my environment. So my belief about tigers is about the things that I'm causally related with, and my belief about tigers is determined by the environment. So the thoughts that I'm having are about tigers, the things around here, and not about some like alternative universe Schmeiger. And they're about tigers and not Schmeigers because tigers are the things that are in my environment. Same thing with like my concept of water. When I think about water, I'm thinking about something that is in my environment. I'm thinking about H2O. Even if I haven't taken chemistry before, my thoughts about water are thoughts about H2O. That's necessary, even though I might not, you know, have thought about it for a long time. Basically, all of those things, the things that my thoughts are about, are determined by my environment, not by me. And if that's true, then that means that even my beliefs have external components. And so Williamson is saying, well, beliefs having external components means that, you can't distinguish belief from knowledge by knowledge having an external component and belief not, unless you're already a content internalist. But content externalist views, which are the kinds that Williamson has, don't allow for that distinction. So Williamson thinks basically the orthodoxy can't stand. And I want to ask you, what do you think about his counter arguments? What do you think about each of these? Does knowledge not entail belief? Can knowledge entail belief even if, knowledge is conceptually prior to belief? Does that not mean that there's a way to build it out of belief? And do you think that knowledge, the factivity of knowledge, doesn't preclude it from being a mental state? So this is one thing that Williamson says. He thinks that knowledge is a mental state, just like belief is a mental state. Knowledge is something that's in our heads. Well, before we get too deep into thinking about these arguments, let's maybe look at Williamson's positive case. Why think that knowledge is first? Sure, maybe there's these problems with belief first epistemology, which is what he calls the rival view, but why think positively about knowledge first epistemology? Why think that knowledge is conceptually prior to belief? And that there's a picture of Tim Williamson. So one reason why we should think that knowledge is conceptually prior to belief, says Williamson, is that on his view, knowledge is an attitude. Notice how this is a different view than the Greco-Sosa view, right, on which knowledge is an achievement. On Williamson's view, knowledge is not an achievement, knowledge is an attitude. It's an attitude like belief. My attitude that it is cloudy, for example, that's knowledge. I know that it's cloudy outside, it's rainy. So on his view, it does depend on external factors, such as whether it is actually cloudy, but this doesn't preclude knowledge being a mental state. A further reason why he thinks that knowledge is an attitude is that he subscribes to an epistemic view called disjunctivism. According to disjunctivism, the epistemic agent in the skeptical scenario, so like the brain in the vat, is deeply impoverished with respect to knowledge, while the one in the common sense scenario is not deeply impoverished. So the brain in the vat and the brain in the regular body have different information from each other. They have a very deep difference in knowledge. And so for Williamson, this means they're in different mental states, even if it doesn't feel different from the inside. So for Williamson, the brain in a vat is in very different mental states than the brain in the body, even if, they can't tell the difference. Even if for Neo in the Matrix, it feels just the same as for me in the regular world before I find a glitch in the Matrix or something, there's actually a deep difference in the mental states that are being had by each person. So this is the disjunctivist view. So he subscribes to this view. And there are arguments in favor of that. I won't cover them now. Maybe we'll talk about them in class. But basically the idea is disjunctivism has it that the brain in a vat and the brain in the body are in different mental states. Williamson says that means that knowledge is an attitude. Knowledge is a mental state. And it's a different mental state. The brain in a vat doesn't have it, right? What's another reason why knowledge is conceptually prior to belief and justification? Well, Williamson thinks one reason is that knowledge is better for explanation of action than mere true belief. He thinks that continuous actions are only possible because of knowledge. So why do I go through all of the steps of making spaghetti, say? Well, it must be because I know that I've completed the prior step. I couldn't explain my continuing to do the rest of the steps unless I already knew that I had completed the prior ones. Mere true belief, he thinks, wouldn't be enough to explain successful continuous action. If I always had to kind of be a little bit dubious or something, or if I didn't have the security of knowledge, he just thinks that I wouldn't act continuously. This might be a good point to call back the Theaetetus, because in the Theaetetus, this is problematized. Socrates suggests that maybe true belief is just as good to get us, sorry, this is in the Meno, to get us to Larissa as knowledge. So it doesn't matter whether you get someone with true belief or someone with knowledge of how to get to Larissa, they'll both get you there. Williamson is of the opinion that knowledge gets you kind of more security, and it gets you enough security that it's better at explaining actions, successful actions, maybe repetitive actions, things that you do over and over again successfully are better explained by your knowing what you're doing. Also, he thinks that deliberation that we do sometimes before action indicates that there's a gap between knowledge and belief. So if I were to be able to act just as well with belief as I can with knowledge, then I would never be able, I would never need to deliberate before I acted. I'd never need to take a moment to make a decision and check what it is that I know. I'd just sort of act on instinct or something, on what my hunch was. And usually I don't act on hunches. So for him, that indicates that knowledge is the thing that explains my actions better. And that's the thing that I'm looking to have before I act. A final reason why he thinks that knowledge is conceptually prior to belief is that knowledge is also, on his view, conceptually prior to evidence and to justification. And here he gives us a definition. He thinks that one's total evidence is simply one's total knowledge. So basically he thinks knowledge equals evidence. And that is why knowledge justifies. Knowledge justifies, it's not what gets justified. So the reasons that I give for things, the evidence that I give for why I believe certain conclusions or certain propositions or stuff like that, is because I have knowledge. I cite my knowledge as a reason why I believe. And he thinks that that relationship, my knowledge being my reason, means that knowledge is also my evidence. Knowledge equals evidence. And so knowledge is the thing that justifies. It doesn't itself need justification. Rather, justification is something you pull out of your knowledge. It's a use you put your knowledge to, on his view. And also on his view, this helps end the regress of justification. The regress problem gets solved because when you give a reason, you're giving knowledge. You're not giving like a mere belief that you have, another seeming way that things are. He thinks that when you answer the why question successfully to end the regress, you're giving knowledge. So it's kind of a Morean response, if you will. So basically you end up connecting your justification to knowledge. And here's an objection he considers at this point. Doesn't this make knowledge self-justifying in kind of a trivial way, right? If knowledge is what justifies, then isn't knowledge justifying itself? Like, isn't that circular? Like, what's going on? It feels like we wanted to learn something when we learned that, you know, evidence is something that gives us knowledge. But now you're saying that knowledge is what gives us evidence. That seems messy. Williamson replies, no. The point of justification isn't just to serve as a condition for knowledge. Justification is a status which knowledge can, quote, confer on beliefs that look good in its light, unquote. So basically, he thinks that we were wrong about what the role of justification is. The role of justification isn't to fill in some gap between belief and knowledge. The point of justification is to confer a status on things that we know to be our beliefs, and to say, hey, these beliefs, they're in a good place. We're dignifying them with this status of being justified or something like that. So I suppose you could think that like calling something justification is like a compliment to it, something like that. And knowledge is the means by which you complement in this way, I suppose. So one final problem we'll talk about, and then I'll wrap up for today. And we'll talk about the rest in class. One big problem for knowledge first epistemology is epistemic transparency. Basically, one is not always in a position to know whether one knows something, right? The whole reason that we got into the trying to analyze knowledge into its component parts is because we're worried about things like skepticism. We want to know when we know. And that's presumably how we get out of the brain in a vat problem. It's because we know we're not brains in a vat. And in order to know we're not brains in a vat, we've got to be able to give the reasons why we think we're not brains in a vat, right? And that seems to require epistemic transparency, that one is in a position to know whether you know. But if knowledge is conceptually prior to belief and to justification, then it just feels like we're not going to be able to do this, right? Because we don't always know that we know, and that's the whole problem. That's how we got into this mess, right? All right, so here's an argument, basically furthering this point. If knowledge is a mental state, which is what Williamson thinks, and if something is a mental state only if you could be in a position to know it, right? That's one of the issues. I know that I have my beliefs when I have beliefs, because there's something it feels like to have a belief. It's accessible to me when I believe something most of the time. And that's because it's a mental state. It's something inside me. And so I can kind of stop and think about it and try to access it. At least in principle, it's accessible to me. So if knowledge is supposed to be a mental state, but I can't access it that way, then we don't have transparency. This is a problem. So probably knowledge is not a mental state because it's not transparent in this way. It's not accessible to us, not even in principle, right? And Williamson says, well, why believe that, any mental states are going to be accessible to you? Why believe that the condition for something being knowledge is going to be something accessible to you? He thinks that any old condition, like a condition on knowledge, whether it obtains isn't luminous. That is, we're not in a position to know the condition obtains just because we can wonder whether the condition obtains. So he thinks sometimes we know, and a lot of times we know, even though we don't know that we know. So even though knowledge is a mental state, we're not always in a position to know we're in that mental state. And he thinks that's fine because we don't have access to the conditions that make our knowledge knowledge. And he has an argument. It's called the anti-luminosity argument. I'm not going to go over it now in a lot of detail, but basically the problem is that if you expect something to be luminous, to be like accessible to you, for you to be in a position to know, then it must be that similar close conditions are indistinguishable. But then that would mean that because our powers of discrimination are more limited than these distinct conditions, it would mean that every condition would be luminous. It's kind of messy. We'll talk about it later. But basically, he just thinks that the condition on whether knowledge obtains is not luminous. It's a little bit easier to understand this if we link this up to Moore's reasoning and the reasoning of the reliabilists. So sometimes you know, even though you don't know that you know, and knowledge is just kind of basic. You are sometimes having knowledge and you're sometimes justified in believing things because you have knowledge, but it's not because you know that you know. It's kind of just a causal relationship between yourself and the world. Here's another argument that problematizes this epistemic transparency angle. And it says, but if we know when we know, we can't know that we know, and then what use, sorry, let me say that again. But if when we know, we can't know that we know, what use is knowledge, right? If when we know, we can't know that you know, what's the point of this analysis? And on your view, knowledge is evidence. So it's kind of important. We need to know what our evidence is, but if we can't know that we know, then we can't know what our evidence is. And that seems bad, right? And Williamson does this tricky thing where he makes a bug look like a feature, in my view. So he says we can know that we know sometimes. In the good cases, we do know that we know. In the good cases, we know our evidence. We know that we know. But in order to know, in order to have those good cases, he thinks there's got to be a margin for error. In order to know that we know, we've got to be in a position to be able to discriminate between when we do know and when we don't know. But in between those cases where we can discriminate and the ones where we can't, there will be this messy zone, the buffer zone, where in that buffer zone, we won't be in a position to know that we know. So there's these great cases where we know that we know, and then there's these weird cases where we know, but we don't know that we know. And that's the buffer zone between the know that we know cases and the total ignorance cases, which are over here. And so he thinks that it's just a condition on having these good cases that there be this messy buffer zone. That buffer zone is why we can't guarantee that we know just because we have knowledge. Because in the good cases where we know that we know, it's partly because there's this gap where we know, but we don't know that we know, between knowledge on the one hand and ignorance on the other hand. So he thinks it's to be expected that we can't be guaranteed to know that we know, because it's a prerequisite on having these good cases, that there be this buffer, basically. So that's it for now. I think that's a pretty good summary of this introduction. Lots of issues came up. Main question for you is, do you think that this analysis where we put knowledge first and then we explain belief and justification in terms of knowledge, does that solve some problems? Can you see it doing good work for us in epistemology? So Williamson just says, if we start with knowledge, now we can get the project going and not sit around and wait for this Gettier problem to be solved. We can actually connect knowledge with action. We can start putting it to work. So he thinks it's great. But what do you think? That's it. Thank you for tuning in. See you later. Bye.